Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a video about terminal services. In this video, we'll take a look at exactly what terminal services is, as well as some additional role services that go along with terminal services, including the terminal services gateway, web access, and session broker. Then we'll take a look at what's going on with Globalmatics, what they're trying to do, and talk about how to solve the situation. Then we're going to go into the operating system and actually install terminal services as well as the additional role services. And then we'll go in and do some configuring. After we've got that all set up, we'll talk a little bit about using something called remote app versus remote desktop. And then we'll go in and configure a remote app version of terminal services. So, first of all, what is terminal services? Well, it says right here, terminal services is really nothing more than an extension of remote desktop services. In other words, if you're at all familiar with how remote desktop works, and well, you should be, we've used it throughout this entire course. Every time I go to connect to one of our machines, we're making a remote desktop connection to that computer. Well, really, terminal services is like remote desktop on drugs. Matter of fact, if you go back to previous generations of terminal services, if you go back to Windows 2000 as a for instance, the remote desktop actually was called terminal services. You used to install terminal services and there was one of two modes. There was something called application mode, which was your true terminal services, the way it'll be described in this lesson. And then you had terminal services in remote administration mode, which is what then became just simply remote desktop. Now, to take that a step further, terminal services basically allows a client to access a session on a terminal server, still using that remote desktop client. So all this time, when you see me clicking on one of my shortcuts on the desktop with the remote desktop client, you don't know if I'm just connecting to a server via remote desktop, or I might be connecting using terminal services if it's been configured on that server. The client really doesn't ever know. Okay, so when we say accessing a session on that terminal server, it means you can actually log in as though you were physically sitting right at that server. Now, what is the difference between terminal services and remote desktop services? Well, the main difference is licensing. Remote desktop has a limited amount of connections available, whereas terminal services has an unlimited amount of connections available to it, subject to the client access licenses that you purchase to allow those connections. Now, I will tell you that when it comes to purchasing the client access licenses, when it comes to the whole licensing situation, it is very important that you do get together with an authorized licensing specialist. They are the ones that are trained to look at your situation and tell you exactly how many licenses need to be purchased and in what format. Now, a few additional role services that are available within the terminal services role on Windows Server 2008. First of all would be the terminal services gateway. Now, this is a way of allowing users to basically have these remote desktop type connections via the internet, meaning via an unsecure network. And this is done by using the Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP, over HTTPS. Okay, so basically by using the secure socket layer of HTTP on the internet, users can now connect to a local terminal server. This pretty much would take the place of what we used to do in the past is we used to have to VPN into the local network. And that's how we would get our secure connection. And then once VPN'd in, we would connect to the terminal server. Well, this takes the place of that. We no longer need to go through the two steps. We don't have to VPN in first. The second role service would be TS Web Access. Now, by its name, it may sound like what I just described as the TS gateway. The difference is with web access, it's not about giving you specific secure connectivity over the internet, but allowing users to connect to the terminal server via a web page as opposed to using the typical remote desktop client. One thing that I should mention is, although I say here instead of the remote desktop client, the remote desktop client still needs to be present on the client because it is still truly used. It's still the remote desktop client that's being used behind the scenes to make the connection, but it allows an interface that might be easier for some users to understand. So we'll take a look at that once we get into the actual operating system. The last one we have here is the TS Session Broker. Now, the Session Broker actually has a lot of complexity to it. But to simplify an explanation, it says here that it manages connections to a farm of terminal servers. So if you want to have, or if you need to have, more than one terminal server in order to satisfy the demands within your network, okay, maybe you have too many clients that need to make connections for one server to have enough resources. So you need to add a second terminal server, and then you want the two, or it could be 3 or 4 or 5 or however many terminal servers, you want them all to act as one transparent entity to the client. So it's almost like saying you're creating a cluster of terminal servers, if you're familiar with that term. But a farm of terminal servers can be set up and then is managed by the session broker. The session broker, through load balancing, has the ability to evaluate which terminal server is most readily available, meaning which terminal server has the most available connections, and then send a client to that one terminal server. And through something called DNS round robin, it has the ability to also reconnect a user with the same server that it was previously connected to if it got disconnected. So if you have this farm set up, one of the issues is that a user may connect to a terminal server in the farm. So we'll just say terminal server number 1 in a farm of 5, let's say. And then something unforeseen happens and the client gets disconnected. I mean, there's a lot of things that can happen to where you can get disconnected, but you end up getting disconnected, but you're right in the middle of something. Well, when you get disconnected, this session is still running on the terminal server. So through the session broker, it can take a look, know where you were connected, and then send you back to the original terminal server. All right, so what's going on with Global Mantix these days? Well, it says here that Global Mantix needs to roll out a new line of business application for all of its sales users. The new application has hardware requirements which exceed the current client configuration. So basically what we're saying here is that there's a new application that all the sales users are going to need to have, but their computers, the ones that they currently use, aren't equipped with the resources necessary to run that application. Now, they don't want to upgrade any of the client's computer hardware or software. Okay, and I say or software because you'll see in a little bit here that we do have some clients in the Global Mantix network with Windows XP, and XP is not going to give you full functionality when connecting to a terminal server running on Windows Server 2008, by default anyway. We'll take a look at that. Users must be able to use the application while connecting from anywhere in the world. So because they're sales users, they won't necessarily always be in the local office. They're out traveling and they're going to need to be able to have access to this application. And the solution must provide for complete SPF protection. You know what SPF protection is, right? That's right. It's sun protection factor, right? You know, to help keep you from being burnt by the sun out on a hot summer day. No, in this case, SPF stands for single point of failure. So we need to make sure that this application is always available, even in the event that there is a failure within, well, I don't know, maybe a terminal server. So anyway, what are we going to do about this? Well, we are going to go ahead and deploy 2 terminal servers. Okay, so I guess the first thing would be to make the decision to use a terminal server. Why are we going to do this? Well, because we don't want to upgrade the client hardware or software, so we're going to go ahead and roll out a terminal server. But we can't have one because we have to avoid single point of failure. So we're going to go ahead and deploy 2 terminal servers. Now, access to these servers will be managed with the Terminal Services Session Broker. Now, we will use the Terminal Services Gateway as well as web access to provide access from outside the local network. And then the Remote Desktop Client 6.1 will need to be installed on any Windows XP clients to allow full-featured connectivity. Okay, and this should satisfy all the needs in the Global Mantix environment. So, how about we get in there and get this done? What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and install the Terminal Services role on the 2 servers. We're going to install TS Gateway, Web Access, and Session Broker on, well, at least one of those servers. We'll then go in and configure session rules for these terminal servers, as well as configuring the terminal servers to participate in the farm. And then we're going to wrap things up by talking a little bit about remote app versus remote desktop, and then we're going to deploy an application using remote app to see how that all works. All right, well, let's go take a look now. Now, for this demonstration, we are going to go ahead and use Chicago DC1 and Chicago MEM1 as our 2 terminal servers. Now, there's a couple things I want to point out. One, we're doing this in Chicago because, as we know from previous videos, the sales department is primarily in Chicago. The second thing is, generally, you would not be putting a terminal server on your domain controller. I mean, especially for this scenario, right? We're about to deploy a line of business application. Well, generally, you're not going to want that kind of thing and those kind of resources to be tied up on a domain controller. It just doesn't make sense. The reason I'm going to do it here is specifically because there is an extra step involved with making terminal services work properly when you do it on a domain controller. And I want you to be able to see that. So although typically you wouldn't do it on a domain controller, there may be some scenarios where you will have to, and I want you to know what that extra step is when installing terminal services on a domain controller. So let's go ahead and connect to Chicago DC1 now. And we will make that the first terminal server that we're going to install. Okay, now that we are connected to Chicago DC1, the first thing we need to do is, well, install the role. And of course, by this point, you should know that where we do that is in the Server Manager. So I'm going to click Start and select Server Manager. And then in the Server Manager, I'm going to go ahead and click on Roles. And then it'll take just a moment here while it figures out what roles we currently have. And as soon as it does, we'll go ahead and click on Add Roles. And there we go. So I'm going to go ahead and click Add Roles. And the role that we want to add is right here, Terminal Services. Check that box and click Next. And here's an introduction into what Terminal Services is. I'll click Next. And you'll see here it's going to ask me what role services we want to install. Well, we want to install the terminal server, right? We want to be a terminal server. And you'll notice that it's giving us a warning here about installing a terminal server on a server that has Active Directory domain services. It's generally not recommended, but we're going to go ahead and do it anyway because we know exactly what we're doing. Now, there's also a role for terminal services licensing, and this would be if you wanted this computer to manage all of your licenses. But we're not going to worry about that for right now, and the reason why is because we can go ahead and connect to a terminal server for up to 120 days without any licenses. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Now we're going to need the Session Broker, Gateway, and Web Access. So I'm going to click all 3 boxes. You'll notice that when I click the box for the TS Gateway, it says that I need other services and features. Primarily, if you take a look, it's talking about the fact that we need things like IIS, right? We need to be a web server and network policy server. So we'll go ahead and add those services as well, and then check the box for TS web access. I will also tell you that if I had not added those additional role services for Terminal Services Gateway, it would have asked me for some of those for the TS web access as well. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next now that we have all our role services in place. You'll notice here it talks about uninstall and reinstall applications for compatibility. It's recommended that you install the terminal server before installing any applications that you want available to the users. And basically what it comes down to is when a program is installed on a server that's not running terminal services, it's not really equipped to serve multiple sessions and multiple users within those sessions. Whereas once a computer does have the terminal server role, the application installation will automatically say, hey, this is a terminal server, so I should equip myself to handle all these different sessions. So it's generally a good idea to install terminal server first, which is what we're doing here, by the way. We're going to install terminal server and then I'm going to install the applications. But if the application was already installed, there's either modifications that could had to be made to that program, or you might have to go ahead and uninstall it and reinstall it anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. Here is where you get to choose whether you want to require network level authentication or not. And basically what it comes down to is do you want to support previous versions of Windows as well as previous versions of Remote Desktop. Now, even though we're going to go ahead and upgrade the Remote Desktop connection client on any Windows XP clients, I'm going to go ahead and, since we know we have Windows XP clients, I'm going to recommend that we do not require network level authentication at first, but then we can come back and do this later once we know that all of our clients definitely can meet the requirements. I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. Here it wants to know about the licensing mode. And like I mentioned earlier, you want to talk to an authorized licensing specialist who can tell you exactly how, not only how many you need, but what mode you want to be in. Do you want to be per device or per user? And there are stipulations that come with each. But in this case, we're going to configure later because we have up to 120 days before it's going to bother us with this. I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. Here we need to select groups that are going to be allowed access to this terminal server. Now you'll notice that here it says these users and groups will be added to the local remote desktop users group. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and click on Add. And in the North America domain, I'm going to put in sales and check names. And you'll see here, here's the sales users group, of which all of our sales users are a member of. So I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is an extra step that goes beyond just this on a domain controller. So when we're all done with this wizard, I will go ahead and show you what that extra step is. Let me go ahead and click on Next. On this screen, it's asking about installing a certificate for SSL encryption. Now, here's the thing. I could choose an existing certificate if we had one, but this would have to be issued, this would be if I went out to, let's say, VeriSign and went and got a certificate for this server. But this is something that is required if you're going to use the Terminal Services Gateway. Matter of fact, if you look down here, it says, this option is recommended for small-scale deployments or test scenarios only. After installing TS Gateway, you must manually install the certificate on clients that communicate with this server. And that's because with a self-signed certificate, the clients aren't going to already trust the signer of the certificate. In other words, if we went out to a third party, a trusted third party like VeriSign, well then all of the client computers would already be pre-configured to know about these trusted third parties, whereas in this case, there's no way for them to be pre-configured, so you'd have to install it manually. We could also choose to do this later, But then you'll notice right here it says for TS Gateway to function, you have to have a valid certificate. So we'll go ahead and create a self-signed certificate for SSL and click Next. Now this screen talks about creating authorization policies for the Terminal Services Gateway. And if you just kind of look at what it says right on the screen, a Terminal Services Connection Authorization Policy, okay, or TS CAP as it's sometimes referred to, allows you to specify the users who can connect to this gateway server. If you used a Terminal Services Resource Authorization Policy, and I will tell you, the only words that change, only one word changes there. You have connection up here and you have resource here, which of course makes this TS wrap, right? You got TS CAP and TS wrap. And I will tell you, you're going to want to know the differences between them. TS CAP, again, was for specifying the users who can connect, whereas TS wrap allows you to configure a mapping between user groups and the computers that they can connect through. So if you want to control which terminal server, aka a resource, which terminal server that certain users and groups are going to need to be connected through, that would be done via TS wrap. And then it goes on to basically say that you can use this wizard to go ahead and create both authorization policies. And until you create both a TS CAP and a TS wrap, users aren't going to be able to connect to network resources through the TS gateway server. So we'll go ahead and click now. We want to go ahead and create these policies right now because it's going to be a requirement. We're setting up a TS gateway. So if I click next, here you'll see that it takes us into the TS gateway user groups. It says here, add the groups that will be associated with both TS CAP and wrap. Okay, and well, because we know this is for our sales users, once again, I'm going to click add, and then I'm going to put in sales, just click check names, and you'll see here we get the sales users. Click OK. If I click next, here it talks about how we have to create a TS CAP to allow users to connect to this gateway server. Only members of user groups that you select will be allowed to connect. So what are we going to do? We're going to create a name for the TS CAP. Well, I'm not real worried about the name right now, so we'll just leave the default, just saying, look, I have to do this, and we're only doing this for the one group, so let's just kind of make it happen. So we'll leave the name alone. It says you must then specify at least one supported Windows authentication method, and there's nothing really that we've talked about as far as smart cards, and Global Mantix is not equipped with smart cards yet, so we're going to go ahead and just leave it with password protection. Go ahead and click next. Now we have to go ahead and come up with a name for TS wrap. Well, we'll take the default again, TS wrap 1, no big deal there. So it says here, specify which computers are accessible through this TS wrap. Well, the choices are here, allow users to connect only to computers in the following group, or you could say go ahead and allow users to connect to any computer on the network. Okay, and here it talks about this means they can get to any computer that's accessible via remote desktop. It's your choice. You could go ahead and limit this right down to a specific group of computers. Okay, and if I click browse, I can go ahead and add specific computers in. Or I can go ahead and say any computer on the network, which is what we're going to do in this instance, because we don't have any specific limitations that we need to have here. I'm going to go ahead and click on next. Now it talks about the network policy and access services. Okay, remember that was something that had to be done as part of installing the Terminal Services Gateway role service. If I go on, it asks me, it's pretty much asking me, hey, what role services do you want to have? And I'm just going to take the default because we're not real worried about any of these extras right now. We just know that we need the network policy server as a requirement. So I'll click next. And then again, here comes web server, IIS, role services. Again, I will just take the defaults. It's all been configured for me. There's nothing special I have to do. I'll go ahead and click on next. Here I get my confirmation screen where you'll see that there is an awful lot that we're doing here. Okay, but I want to point out a couple things. One, here's the little warning that I might need to reinstall any existing applications. No big deal there. We knew that that was the case, and I have not installed the application yet. If I go down here, you'll notice under the session broker, it talks about additional configuration that's going to happen. You're going to have to add computer accounts for the terminal servers in the farm. So in other words, we're going to have to say what terminal servers are going to be part of the farm. And then we're going to have to actually configure the session broker settings on each server in the farm, as well as some additional information. So let me go ahead and click install. And as you could imagine, since there are a number of things that are being installed right now, this is going to take a little while. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and I will come back as soon as this is all complete. Okay, well, as you can see, all of our roles have finished installing, but this is kind of an alarming page, isn't it? When you see this come up, your instant reaction is like, uh-oh, get kind of scared. You see all these yellow triangles with exclamation points, all these warnings. Well, all this means is that you have to restart. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and close this. And then it says, do you want to go ahead and restart now? So I'm going to go ahead and restart now. And then I will pause the video and come right back as soon as the computer is done rebooting. Okay, the computer has rebooted, so let's go ahead and reconnect to it. Okay, there we go. And what should happen automatically here is the server manager should open back up again, as it does anytime you reboot after installing a role. And it will then tell us that everything has been complete, or tell us if we need to do anything additional. Okay, so pretty much the installation is complete. It's still collecting the data, so we'll give it just another moment so that it can finish that. Which, by the way, I will tell you on a side note, it's always a good idea after installing a role and then having to, there's not many that require a reboot, but for the ones that do, it's really a good idea to go ahead and let this process finish before you try going forward and doing anything, because I can tell you from personal experience, I've been impatient and then just went ahead and said, all right, blah, 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 don't need to do that. Just go ahead and start doing the next thing I want to do. And then I end up causing a conflict of some kind. So as you can see here, it's now resuming the configuration, which will take just another brief moment. And then it should tell us that the installation is complete. And here we go. You see here that it's finishing up the terminal services, network policy services, web server, and also this RPC over HTTP proxy. That has to do, by the way, with the whole using web access, terminal services gateway, all that stuff to make sure that we can do the RDP over HTTPS. And as you can see, it's actually taking just a little bit longer than a brief moment. So give it just another moment and it should be done here. Oh, you'll see here that it pops up telling us that terminal services licensing mode is not configured, and well, we have 119 days left, so let's not worry about that. We'll go ahead and close that. We're not going to need 119 days to demonstrate this, but remember, in production environment, you're going to need to make sure you go out and do that. And boom, as you can see here, installation has succeeded across the board. All right, so let me go ahead and click on close. And we will go ahead and close out of our server manager. Now, that one extra step that I said was going to be required on a domain controller is that basically, by default, on a domain controller, only the administrators can log on locally. And that's something very specific to keep in mind, because when somebody connects to a terminal server via the remote desktop connection, it's as though they are physically at that computer. So what that means is they're logging on locally. So what we need to do, oh, here we go with our little warning message again. It's just going to keep coming up. Is we need to go ahead and allow the sales users the right to log on locally to this domain controller. So I'm going to click Start, and I'm just going to go ahead and put in GP edit .msc. And what that's going to do is that's going to take us into our local group policy. And in our local policy, meaning the policy for this computer, I'm going to expand Windows settings, expand security settings, expand local policies, and then right here is user rights assignments. If I click on that, and then take a look right here where it says allow log on locally, I'm going to double click on it. You'll see here that, well, I said administrators only, but there are other built-in accounts that are, these are all primarily administrator level type accounts. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and, oh, take a look at this. I was going to go ahead and add the group, but look at what it's telling me. I can't. It's grayed out. The reason it's grayed out is because this is being managed at a higher level of group policy. So let's go ahead and close out of here. Click Start, Administrative Tools, Group Policy Management. So instead of doing it through the local policy, because this is going to be managed at a higher level, because there are other group policies, we're going to actually go right here to the domain controllers container, and then here you'll see is the default domain controllers policy. So this would affect all domain controllers, but this is where we're going to have to do it. I'm going to right click and go to Edit, and then I'm going to go to the exact same place under Computer Configuration Policies, Windows Settings, Security Settings. Uh-oh, gave me an error. That's not good. Let me click OK and OK. Let's do what it says. Let's close the Group Policy Management Editor and let's go in and edit it again. And then go to the same place. Expand Policies, Windows Settings, Security Settings. Here it's giving us an error about the wireless network policy storage. Probably has to do with something we did in a previous video. I'm just taking a look here. So we're just going to click OK because we're not dealing with wireless network policy. So I'll click OK. And we'll continue expanding on down to our local policies and then user rights. And then here we have allow log on locally. And now we can add a user or group. And we want to go ahead and let's browse so that we can actually type in sales. Check names, and here you'll see it found the sales users. Click OK and OK, and now the sales users are able to go ahead and log on locally. That is an extra step that must be taken on a domain controller. Let me go ahead and click OK, and we can go ahead and close out of our Group Policy Management Editor, close out of Group Policy Management. Now, the next thing I want to show you is how to configure some session rules for the connections to this terminal server. Now, there's a few different ways that this can be done. The first way, and I'm going to kind of go from the hardest to the easiest. Well, we'll go from hardest to two easy ways of doing it. The hard way is I'm going to go to my Active Directory Users and Computers administrative tool, and in this utility I'm going to go ahead and expand the domain. I'm going to expand Chicago, and then here's sales, right? Here's all our sales users. I want to show you that if I go into the properties of a user, so I just went ahead and double click on the user, you will see that there is a Sessions tab. On the Sessions tab, I can go ahead and configure session information for this specific user. So what this is pretty much saying is I can end a disconnected section after a certain amount of time. And what this means is if somebody were to disconnect as opposed to logging out of a session, well, then the session continues to run. And this is done for protective reasons. I mean, somebody could legitimately be in the middle of something and then get cut off. Well, you don't want whatever they're working on to get messed up, so it continues to run. But you may want to go ahead and set up this particular feature so that if somebody was to intentionally disconnect from a session, right? They didn't log off, they disconnected, but they're actually completely done. Well, after a certain amount of time, you might want to go ahead and end it because you're tying up resources that others might need. Now, a couple other settings is you can put a limit on the total session time, meaning the active session limit means, hey, look, when you connect, you're going to get X amount of time, and then that's it. Now, this would typically be done if you had a scenario where, let's say, your terminal server could only handle 20 connections, but you had 100 people who might want to connect. Well, you might want to go ahead and say, hey, look, since there are 5 times as many people who want to connect or need to connect as the server can handle, you're all going to have to take turns. Therefore, you each only get X amount of time. This next one is the idle session limit, and this has to do with disconnecting after the session has gone idle, right? Maybe somebody has connected and then they go to lunch, or maybe they go home for the day and they don't log out of the session. They don't even disconnect from the session. Well, you might want to say, hey, look, if it sits idle, they're done. Let's get them out of there. Okay, and go ahead and put a limit on how long it would sit idle before that happens. Now, when these session limits are reached, what do you want to do? Do you want to disconnect the user from the session, or do you want to end the session, meaning truly log them out? And here is what I recommend. I recommend that you, if you're going to set these limits, at the end of that limit, disconnect them from the session, especially that idle session limit. Disconnect them after a certain amount of time. So let's say if they go idle for 15 minutes, we can disconnect them from the session. And then up here we can say, hey, if another 15 minutes goes by, now let's log it out altogether. Now let's end it. See, because what that does is sometimes somebody might be in a session and then the phone rings and they get on a phone call and they're distracted, so they're not doing anything on the computer. But when this idle session limit hits and they get disconnected, well, their computer screen is going to change. They may recognize that and say, whoa, wait a minute, I was in the middle of something. And then they will go ahead and reconnect. And as long as they do so within the second 15 minutes, they won't lose what they were doing. Only if the entire half hour goes by would they actually get logged out and potentially lose whatever it is they're doing. And again, there is no rule about 15 minutes. Those were just hypotheticals that I threw in there. Now, speaking of reconnection, that's the last setting down here. Do you want to allow reconnection from any client or only from the originating client? And what that means is if I am sitting at a computer and I connect to a terminal server and then I disconnect from that terminal server, do I want to allow the user to be able to reconnect to that same session from anywhere in our network, or only from the computer they were originally sitting at? And this is done for security reasons. Sometimes you'll say from the originating client only, meaning I'm not letting you disconnect and then somebody recognizes that, so they hack in as you from somewhere else. Okay, so again, those are all the session rules that you can set up on an individual basis. And yes, this is the hard way of doing it, because that means I would have to go to each one of these users and do it separately. But it is something that you may want to do in the event that you have separate needs for separate users. Now, another way that we could do this, let me go ahead and close this, is I'm going to take us right back into a utility we were just in. I'm going to go back into Group Policy Management. In here, we can, and I'm not going to do the default domain controllers policy, but I'm just going to go up here to the default domain policy. And again, we would want to set up specific group policies for this. I'm just going to choose this one so we can look at a group policy. I'm going to go in and edit it because I want to show you that there's a couple things we can do in here. One, under user configuration, I can go to policies, administrative templates, Windows components, and then down here you'll see there's terminal services. And let me actually move this over just a little bit so that we can see what we're looking at. Here we have the terminal server, so I'll expand that. And then here we have session time limits. And this is, let me go to standard so we lose this left column here. There we go. We can set a time limit for disconnected sessions, active by idle sessions, active sessions altogether, terminate sessions when time limits are reached, and set time limit for log off of remote app sessions, which actually we'll talk about remote app in a little bit. But the point is that if we have different needs for different users, rather than going to each user individually, we could use group policy to control different groups of users with regards to the session limits. Now let me go ahead and close back out of here, not out of the group policy editor altogether, but now under computer configuration. If I expand policies, expand administrative templates, expand Windows components, scroll down just a little bit, expand terminal services, and then we have terminal server. Again, you'll see here that we have the session time limits. Go to standard here, make it easier to see. This would be done if we wanted to go ahead and manage these properties on the server itself, on the terminal server. So this would be done for a group policy that's affecting the actual terminal servers as opposed to users connecting to the terminal server. Okay, so I just want to show you that these things can also be controlled through group policy. So that's another one of the easier ways of doing this. Now let me go ahead and close this. And actually we can close out of group policy management altogether, because what I'd now like to show you is I'm going to click on Start, Administrative Tools, and then up here you'll see there's actually a folder for terminal services which expands into a number of other things to choose from. And here I'm going to go into Terminal Services Configuration. In here, what I can do is I can right click on this RDP-TCP. So if I right click and go to Properties, you will see here that again there is a Sessions tab, and now in this case we have a checkbox to choose whether we want to override the user settings. So regardless of what the user may be set up for, we can say, hey, you know what? If you're going to connect to me, if you're going to connect to this terminal server, these are my session rules, and you're going to abide by them. Now, one other thing that I want to show you, as long as we're in this particular property window, is right here where it's under the Network Adapter tab. Remember how I mentioned you may have a terminal server that can only support 20 connections? Well, this is where you can put that in. Basically, what you're doing is you need to take a look at the resources that are available, and then go ahead and based upon that determine how many connections, and actually I shouldn't just say resources available along with, well, what is it that users will be doing when they're connected, okay, and how that relates against the resources that are available. Determine how many of those connections you can handle, and then you can enforce that right here. Okay, so that's how you can control the sessions to your terminal server. Now, the next thing I'd like to show you, if I scroll down just a little bit here, is you'll notice that here it says TS Session Broker, right? That's the one thing we haven't really configured yet. Actually, before I configure that, let me just mention, the Terminal Services Gateway we configured as part of installing the role service, right? While we were installing the role service, we had to go through and set up our TS cap and our TS wrap and all that stuff. TS Web Access, it didn't ask us to configure. Well, that's because there's nothing really to configure. It does it all for you. All TS Web Access does is basically create the virtual directory in the default website on this particular computer. When we go to that client to make a connection to this terminal server, I'll show you that there is a URL already in place to make that connection. So the one thing that we still haven't really configured is the TS Session Broker. Now this is very interesting because this right here is actually a selectable item, even though it doesn't really look like it. See, if I click on it, it highlights, but to be more specific, I can either double click or I can right click and go to Properties. And then here, what we could do is go ahead and say join a farm in the TS Session Broker. And then here we need to go ahead and put in the name of the server or the IP address of the TS Session Broker. Now, this specific terminal server is the Session Broker, so I'm going to go ahead and put in Chicago DC1 2K8, right? And then we need to give the farm a name. So how about we call it, we'll call it sales underscore TS underscore farm, right? So it's the sales terminal server farm. That's a good name, right? Now we can choose here whether we want to participate in Session Broker load balancing. Remember I talked about the load balancing and keeping track of if the terminal server is available, or I shouldn't say if it's available, but which terminal server is most readily available. And I'll tell you what, right here it says relative weight of this server in the farm. This is just a number, okay? It's a relative number to any other servers which are participating in the farm. When we set up our second terminal server, or third, or fourth, or fifth, if those terminal servers have identical resources and should be treated as equals, well, then you want to put in the same number. If we're going to have multiple terminal servers and they're not equal when it comes to available resources, if maybe one server is twice the capacity of another server, well, then you want to put in twice the number in this relative weight. Here they're talking about using IP address redirection, which is how you want to do it. Basically what this comes down to is redirecting via the IP address as opposed to doing everything directly within the session broker. It has a lot to do with network load balancing as a whole. So we're just going to go ahead and leave that. We don't need to worry about that for right now. And then we need to select the IP addresses that we're going to use for reconnection. So we'll go ahead and check the box for the, you'll notice here, the one IP address. If we had more than one, then we would check the box that we want to be recognized as and click OK. Now you'll see here it says configuration changes have been made to the system registry. However, the user session now active will not be changed. All that really means is somebody who's already connected, they're not going to be affected. Well, nobody's connected yet. We're just getting things set up right now. So I'll click OK. And I will tell you that there is one other step that is not obvious, right? I mean, basically when we went into the properties here, this is the obvious stuff, right? We have all these checkboxes to go through. The not so obvious step is to go ahead and go to DNS. So I'm going to click on Start, Administrative Tools, DNS. And then in here, in the forward lookup zone for NorthAmerica.globalmantics.com, what we need to do is create a host record for the farm name. So I'm going to right click and say New Host. And then the host name is going to be sales_ts_farm. And you'll notice here that the fully qualified name would be salestsfarm.northamerica.globalmantics.com. And the IP address that we're going to go ahead and associate with it will be 192.168.10.205 because that is the IP address of that host. And then we could go ahead and also create the reverse lookup record to match with that. So let's click Add Host. It says that the reverse lookup record can't be created, and I'm going to guess. Let me click OK and done. Yeah, it's because we don't have a reverse lookup zone. So that's no real big deal. We don't need the reverse lookup zone. If it was there, I typically, out of habit, go ahead and create it. To create the record, I should say, that matches to this. But we don't need reverse lookup for what we're doing right now. So here you can see that the sales TS farm is pointing to 192.168.10.205. Now, the next thing that we need to do is go ahead and add another host record for any other terminal servers that participate in this farm. And here we have Chicago Mem1, which is going to be our other terminal server. And you can see it's 10.236. So I'm going to right click, New A record. Once again, we're going to go ahead and put in sales_ts_farm, right? It's the same name. So we're creating a second record with a different IP address of the other terminal server or terminal servers in this farm. And this time we won't bother creating the associated reverse lookup record. We know that that's not necessary. I'll click Add Host, and it's been successfully created. Click OK and done. And here you'll see that I have two records for the same name. And by default, DNS round robin is enabled on Windows Server 2008 and will take place with the assistance of the session broker to send the user to either 205 or 236, depending on who's most readily available. So let's go ahead and close out of here. And then back here, our session broker is completely set up. So all we have to do now is go ahead and set up the other terminal server. So let me go ahead and minimize Chicago DC1, and let's connect to Chicago Mem1. Now, here's the thing that I need to tell you. We are going to do everything exactly the same. All right, we're going to go ahead and click Start and Server Manager. And then once we're in the Server Manager, we're going to go ahead and add the role. Let me click on Roles here. We're going to go ahead and add the role for Terminal Services. The only difference is that we don't need all of the different role services on this server, right? I'm going to click Add Role. We don't need to see this screen anymore. Click Next. That was just the screen that tells us about adding roles. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on Terminal Services. Next. Here's an intro screen. Next. This time we're going to just do the terminal server. Okay, we're not going to use this one to worry about the gateway and the web access. And we don't need the session broker because you only need that on one of the servers. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. It gives us a warning about applications. Click Next. Again, we're going to go ahead and not require network level authentication because we're using Windows XP clients. And although we are going to upgrade the remote desktop client, we want to allow them to be able to connect just in case somebody didn't get their client updated. And once we know they're all updated, we can change that. So I'll click Next. Not worry about licensing for right now. Next. We'll go ahead and add the sales and go ahead and click Check Names. Sales Users. Click OK. Now this time we don't need to do the extra step about adding the right to log on locally because this is not a domain controller. So I'll click Next. Confirmation. Install. And once it's done, it's of course going to ask us to reboot as well. But in the meantime, while it's doing that, let me go ahead and take us back to Chicago DC1 because the next thing we need to do, I'm going to actually close out of here. The next thing we're going to do is now that Terminal Services is installed on this one, we need to install that application. Now, Global Mantix has not actually received this line of business application from the developer yet. So to test that this is truly working, we're just going to go ahead and use Microsoft Office. So let me go ahead and insert that CD into this computer. All right, so let me click on Start, Computer. And you'll see here that I have the Office CD put in, so I'll double click on that, and it takes us right into Setup. Now, I'm not going to worry about a product key because we're able to use Office for a limited amount of time without entering that key, so I'll click Continue. Yes, I know I can only use it a certain amount of time, so I'll click No, I don't want to enter the product key now. I accept the agreement, Continue, and Install Now. Alright, so now we have Office installing. We also have Terminal Services installing on our other computer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and I will come right back as soon as Office and Terminal Services has finished installing. All right, the Office installation has completed, and also just on Chicago Member 1, the Terminal Services installation completed. I went ahead and rebooted the machine and let it finish that process as well. So let me go ahead and close, and then go ahead and close this as well. And as you can see here, if I click on Start, All Programs, here's Microsoft Office, and I could go into any of my Office utilities. So Microsoft Office has been installed on this particular server. Now let's go ahead and go back over to Chicago Member 1 for just a moment. If I come over here to Chicago Member 1, oh, there we go, getting a warning about licensing. Let me click on Start, Administrative Tools, Terminal Services, and then here we have Terminal Services Configuration. In the configuration, if I scroll down, I just want to show you, I'm not a session broker, right? We'd never installed that role. But right here, we have the session broker, and it says, are we the member of a farm? And the answer is no. If I double click on this, I can go ahead and join the farm. Okay, and then I need to give the broker server name or IP address. So I'm going to go ahead and put in Chicago DC1 2K8, right? That's the name of the session broker. And then for the name of the farm, remember that we did the sales underscore TS underscore farm. We can choose to participate in the load balancing. We'll just leave it as an equal relative weight because these servers are equal. Check the box for the IP address, 10.236. There's our warning again. Get rid of that message. And click OK. And again, it tells us, hey, we've made the changes, but anybody active will not be affected. We're okay with that. And boom, now we participate in the farm. So pretty much we are done with Chicago member 1, other than the fact, everything's going to be set up exactly the same. So just everything that we did on Chicago DC 1, we're also doing to Chicago member 1, and that includes the installation of Office. So actually what I'll do is I'll go ahead and put that CD in and install Office on this computer as well. So I'll go ahead and close this. Go ahead and go to my computer here and double click to open up the Office CD. And then go ahead and just kind of click through all of this to go ahead and get Office installed just like we did before. There we go. And while we let that install, just go ahead and go away from that. And what I actually want to do now is I want to take us over to Chicago XP1. Now, I'm not going to do it via remote desktop connection. This is here so that I could go ahead and connect to Chicago XP1 remotely from this particular computer that I've been pretty much recording everything on here. But this is another one of those instances where we have to actually go to the Chicago XP1 computer directly, because it's kind of a challenge to make a remote desktop connection to a computer who's going to then make a remote desktop connection to a terminal server. So let me go ahead and take us over to Chicago XP1 now. Okay, so here we are over on Chicago XP1. So let me go ahead and log in. Just take a moment here. Yeah, we don't need to take a tour of Windows XP. Thank you very much. Okay, so anyway, on Chicago XP1, well, there's a couple things I want to show you. One thing is that I want to just show you making a connection. Now, this is done, as I mentioned before, through the remote desktop connection, and it's really no different than anything we've done before. If I click Start, All Programs, Accessories, Communications, Remote Desktop Connection, here I'll have the opportunity to go ahead and connect with, and check this one out, sales underscore TS underscore farm. Now, that's not the name of an actual server, is it? No, it's the name of the farm. So it'll take us whichever server's more readily available. So I'll click connect. And then you'll see here it connects to the farm, right? Up here it's connecting to the farm. And, well, it looks like the Chicago member 1 server is the one we're connecting to, and the administrator is already logged in. But we don't want to log in as the administrator. We want to log in as one of those sales users. So I'm going to click Other User, and then I'm going to put in NA for North America /A Bowers, because that is one of the sales users. I know, I cheated. I actually jotted that down back when we were looking at the list of sales users. Enter in that user's password. And now I'm logging in as one of the sales users remotely. So picture this. Right now I am on Chicago XP1. I'm on a client computer, right? I'm on A. Bowers' local client computer. But what I did was I went ahead and said, hey, the sales terminal server farm is what I want to connect to, because I want to have this ability to access this application that's installed out on those servers. And so now you'll notice that even though, let me minimize this, even though I'm actually on Windows XP, here now it looks like I'm connected to Windows Server 2008. And sure enough, now I don't know if it's done installing, but let's find out. If I click Start, All Programs, look at, there it is, Microsoft Office. And I could go ahead and click on Office Word, and if it's completed, and I think it has, looks like it, I now have Microsoft Word. Now that's the equivalent of that application that we're going to have, that GlobalMatics needed to have. Okay, so it's all working. I'm going to go ahead and close this. Oh, it wants me to enter my product key. No, not going to do that. No, I don't want to enter it now. Don't need all this extra fun stuff. Blah, blah, blah. Next. No, I don't want to do any of this. Finish. Okay, there we go. Go ahead and close it. So I just wanted to show you that now a regular user out on a regular client has the ability to go ahead and connect to whatever terminal server in the farm is available and have access to the programs on that server. Now, one other thing I want to point out is the difference between logging off and disconnecting. If I just click this X right here, that would be disconnecting. And matter of fact, if I click it, you'll notice it says this will disconnect. The programs will continue to run, but you can reconnect back in. You want your users to be in the habit of not disconnecting, but logging off when they're done. So if I click Start and then log off, now I'm truly closing out of the session altogether. So let me go ahead and real quick, let me pop back over to Chicago Member 1 to verify that that Office installation did complete. All right, if I come down here, Chicago Member 1, yep, it's complete. So I'll close that and close this. All right, just wanted to check on that. So we'll go ahead and let's go back over to Chicago XP1. The reason I wanted to come back over here to Chicago XP1 is because there is one more thing we need to do on the client that we haven't done yet. And that is, see, right now, we're using an older version of the remote desktop connection utility, and that is going to limit some of the capabilities. And it's definitely going to limit security, right? Because we can't do network level authentication. So let me go to Internet Explorer. I'll click Start, Internet Explorer. And you'll see here that I actually have a favorite that I've already saved. Here's for RDC 6.1. I'll tell you what, I found this by doing nothing more than Google searching RDC 6.1, okay? And this will take us to the download. It's a free download from Microsoft for the remote desktop connection utility version 6.1, which will give us the added security and the updated feature set. Now, one thing I need to point out before we do this is that right here it tells you you must have at least XP Service Pack 2. So just to check real fast, if I click Start, right-click My Computer, Properties, you'll see here it tells me I'm running XP with Service Pack 2. So I'm okay as far as that goes. So I'm going to go ahead and click Download. And I'm going to go ahead and actually just click Run. Now, typically, you might want to go ahead and save it and then run it later, but I'm just going to go ahead and click Run. You'll see that it's very small. It's only 1.6 meg. Downloads very quickly. Click Run. And it's going to go through and it's going to do the installation of this particular utility. So I'll go ahead and click Next. I agree. Next. And it's going to go through and update the system. Now, in the meantime, let me go ahead and close the web page in the background. We don't need that anymore. This is going to go through and it's going to install the new remote desktop connection utility. And again, this is optional. This is basically two things I can tell you. One, you only need it if you're running XP. If you're running Vista, you're fine. But secondly, even if you're running XP, as I just showed you, everything will work fine, but with the limited security and limited feature set. So it's just an option if you want to have that increased security and option set. So I'm going to go ahead and click Finish, and it's done. It's installed. So nothing really that dramatically different that you're going to notice here. I just wanted to point out that you indeed may want to install it, and there are some things that'll go on in the background that the user never really needs to be aware of. Now, the one last thing I want to show you is I'm actually going to take us back into Internet Explorer here, because the one last thing I want to show you is that we can also connect to a terminal server using web access or using the web browser. Now, we only installed web access on Chicago DC1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put in HTTP:// and I'm going to put in Chicago DC1 2k8.na.globomantics.com. Okay, that's the full URL. Well, actually, that's the full DNS name. And then with a /TS, which would be the virtual directory, now gives us the full URL. Let me hit enter. to connect us to that terminal server. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and put in a Bowers and the password. Oh, you know what? Left out one piece here. Gotta always mention the domain name. And then, oh, we can actually ignore some of this. Let me go ahead and close this. No, we don't worry about phishing right now. These are just added security things right now. Here you'll see that it does require an ActiveX control. It's not installed or not enabled. So right here, I'm going to go ahead and right click and say run ActiveX control. Go ahead and run it. Close that. And you'll see here that I have a choice between remote app programs, which we haven't gotten into yet, or remote desktop. If I click on remote desktop, let's not worry about the information bar. You'll notice it wants an ActiveX control. So let's go ahead and run that ActiveX control. This really is something that only has to be done initially just to get the clients ready. But basically, I can go ahead now and say I want to connect to, and in this case, I don't have to say specifically Chicago DC1. See, Chicago DC1 was where I was getting the web access. I'm going to go ahead and say that I want to connect to the sales _ TS _ farm. And we're going to go ahead and do it in full screen mode. So I'm going to go ahead and connect. Here it's just giving me a warning about what's going on. So we're going to go ahead and say connect. No big deal. I'm fully aware of what's going on. And here you'll noticing that there's issues about the certificate. Now you remember way back quite a while ago, I had mentioned about a self-signed certificate and how this will be an issue. So we're going to go ahead and say yes, that's okay. Install that certificate. And now you'll notice that everything else is exactly the same as when we did it through the remote desktop connection. So as far as TS web access, it's really nothing more than just kind of almost a personal preference. If you want users to be able to go ahead and connect via a URL as opposed to connecting via a remote desktop connection through the RDC utility. It really doesn't matter, whatever you want to do. So let me go ahead and close out of here. And now the last thing I need to do is show you how to work with a remote app as opposed to remote desktop. So for that, let me go ahead and go back to our terminal servers. All right, so let's go back over here to Chicago DC1. And what I need to do is go ahead and click on Start, and then go to Administrative Tools. Go up here to the Terminal Services folder, if you want to call it that expands out. And now let's go into the Terminal Services Remote App Manager. Here in the TS Remote App Manager, what we want to go ahead and do is over here in the Actions window, we want to go ahead and add a remote app. So I'll click on that, and it takes us into the Remote App Wizard, which this is kind of cool, just so you know. It's all wizard driven, very easy to do. I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. And then here it wants to know what programs you want to go ahead and add as a remote app program. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and we'll put in just Microsoft Word. Okay. And click Next. And we're adding one program. Finish. Now, because we are working in a farm of terminal servers, we have to actually go do this on the other server as well. So let me go ahead and take us back over to Chicago Member 1, and we're going to go through the exact same steps. Start, Administrative Tools, Terminal Services, TS Remote App Manager, and then go ahead and add the remote app. Next, scroll down. Here's Microsoft Office Word. Next, and finish. So we'll go ahead and minimize that. Come back here to Chicago DC1. And now the next thing we need to do is we need to figure out a way to distribute this remote application. Now, I should clarify real quick here exactly what we're doing. What we're doing is changing the way users are going to utilize this terminal server. Right now, without remote app, with just remote desktop, what happens is that a user does a remote desktop connection to the terminal server, and then they can do anything and everything on that terminal server as though they're sitting there. The problem with that is that a lot of users are not necessarily very computer savvy and network savvy, and they just want to be able to click an icon representing an application and have that application open. So that is why we need to go ahead and distribute the remote app now. There are 3 options for distributing this remote app. One would be through TS Web Access. You might recall a few moments ago when we were looking at the web access, there was a tab for remote apps. Now it says here that the TS Web Access Computers group is empty, and so therefore remote programs might be unavailable. Well, actually they're not. What I can tell you is if it turned out that remote app was unavailable, all you'd have to do is go into either computer management on a non-domain controller or into Active Directory users and computers if this was a domain controller, and find the TS Web Access Computers group and go ahead and add computers to that group, and then it would be available. But in this case, it's not an issue. They're already there, and that's pretty much because we already have the gateway set up to allow everything. So we won't worry about that right now. Matter of fact, right here you'll notice there's a check mark saying that all remote app programs are visible in TS Web Access. Okay, so anyway, that's one way, is through TS Web Access. Another way is by creating an RDP file. And this is just a file. Pretty much it's just like a remote desktop connection shortcut that's going to point directly not just to the remote desktop connection, but to this application. Or we could create a Windows installer package, which for all intents and purposes is just going to create the RDP file. So what I want to do is create this RDP file. So I'm going to scroll down here. I'm going to highlight Microsoft Office Word, and then over here we're going to create the RDP file. Oh, but wait a minute, before we do this, we have to make this RDP file available to the clients, so I need to put it in a shared folder. So let's create one. So we'll leave this wizard open, but I'm going to go ahead and go over to the computer, go into my C drive, create a new folder, and we'll just call this folder Remote App. And then I'm going to right click and share the folder, and when sharing it we're going to say everyone can read, and click share. And now we've created a shared folder. So I'll click done, close out of there, and now coming back here to our remote app wizard, we can go ahead and click next. And here we need to specify a location where this RDP file is going to be saved. So I'll click Browse, scroll down a little bit, and here's the Remote App folder. Click OK. So you can see here it's going to put it in the Remote App folder. There's one other change I need to make here, and that is the terminal server settings. We don't want to connect specifically to Chicago DC1. We want to connect to Sales TS Farm, right? Because we participate in a farm. That way it'll take us to whichever server is more readily available. We don't need to worry about our gateway settings. We'll automatically detect it, and we don't need to sign this program with a certificate. So next and finish. And now we've created this RDP file, and it's in the remote app folder. That's what it did. It opened up just Explorer here, so we can actually close that. We don't need that open. All right, so now that RDP file has been created and has been shared. So let's go back to our client and see what happens. All right, back here on Chicago XP1, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click Start, Run, and then I'm going to put in / Chicago DC1 2K8 Remote App, because that is the shared folder that we just created. And in that shared folder, you'll see we find an icon for WinWord. I'm going to go ahead and copy that onto the user's desktop. We could put it on their desktop. We could put it in their start menu. We could put it anywhere we want. Matter of fact, I'm going to go a step further, and I'm going to even rename this to Microsoft Word. Right? Might be a name that a user would be more familiar with. Then all I have to do is go ahead and double click, and it's not just me, it's the user would go ahead and double click on the icon anytime they want to get to Microsoft Word. So here I need to put in my credentials. So A. Bowers, Put in the password. Here, I'm going to actually say to remember my password. That way I won't be bothered with this anymore. Click OK. And now it takes just a moment the first time. There we go. Look at that. It takes us into Microsoft Word. Oh, it's still bothering us about that product key. Let's just get away from that. So here, we're in Microsoft Word. Looks just the same as though I accessed it on my own local computer, but believe it or not, I'm not. If I click on Start, you'll notice all programs, there's no Microsoft Word here. Now again, I could put this RDP file on here, which would make it look to the user like the program exists, but it doesn't. This is via the terminal server. And I also want to show you, let me go ahead and close this. If I double click on this again, because we saved the credentials, it just takes us right into Microsoft Word. Just that simple. Now, to show you the remote app via TS Web, let's go back to Internet Explorer and put in http:// and put in, here we go, Chicago DC1 NA globalmantics.com TS. And of course, we have to put in our credentials. And here you'll notice under Remote App Programs, here we have Microsoft Office Word 2007. And if I click on it, other than the fact that I still get some issues here because we're doing it through the web and there's certificate issues, things like that, I'll hit Connect, put in my credentials, and say remember my password so it doesn't bother me there anymore. Once again, okay, now this error we actually got, I believe, because let me go ahead and close out of here and close out of here. And let me take us back to our terminal server. Okay, this was because of this little warning right here. Okay, so I would have to go ahead and add the computer into that group. And just to show you real fast what we mean by that, this is a domain controller. So in Active Directory, you'll see here that there is, let me go ahead and move this over so it's easier to read. You'll see here, here's the TS Web Access Computers group. We could go ahead and add computers into this group, and then that issue goes away. So that is how we can go ahead and use TS Remote App to really make things easy for the users. And this is something that we could then do in this globalmantics scenario with that custom line of business application that we are looking to deploy. So we've just tested everything. We've set up everything. We've tested it all using Office. All we have to do now is get the program from the developer and install it, and we're ready to go. All right, well, that pretty much brings us to the end of this video. And at this point, you should now know how to install and configure the Terminal Services role. You should also know how to install and configure the TS Gateway, Web Access, and Session Broker role services. You should know how to configure multiple terminal servers to participate in a farm so as to provide SPF protection, right? Not against sunburn, but against single point of failure. And I will tell you, another purpose in participating in a farm also has to do with just performance benefits. You know, if you need more users to connect than a single server can handle, well, there's another reason for having the farm. And you should also now know how to configure Remote App to simplify the process of accessing a terminal server when there's a specific application needed as opposed to complete access to the terminal server. All right, well, that wraps things up. I'll see you in the next video.